There are three major insights that I'd like for you to think on as you read through the chapter on classical China. Each insight touching on recurring patterns and themes of human development. The first is the jaw-dropping coincidence and similarity in human development across two continents in more or less wholly distinct civilizations. The philosophical thought, the systems of rule, the technological advancements of China during nearly the exact time period as the rise of Greek and Roman classical thought, all of these strides point to a major occurrence in human progress that makes one kind of scratch their head. Granted, this didn't happen in a vacuum. There were trade routes between the Roman and Han empires in which some cross-pollination and cultural sharing inevitably happened. Nevertheless, there's more separation than close contact when you look at these two empires. They both brought productive rule to expansive geographies. The technological moves that they made to manage that expansion was remarkably similar. Even their patterns in art, moving toward lifelike replica rather than figurative representation, is the same. So what happened here? One theory that I want to propose is that there was enough data that the humans in those regions collected to start looking inward. Human civilization, starting with the early agricultural experiments in river valleys, had created enough stability and security, adapting into rhythms, cycles, patterns of order, that there was a big enough data set for someone to notice and say, it's kind of funny that humans like to do X, Y, or Z. Both the Greek philosophers and the Chinese, such as Confucius and Mencius, began to make generalizations based on their experience and extrapolated on the paths toward human virtue and goodness, and all of those are grounded in control of the self. And so this idea of the self really started to emerge once you had enough security and stability to look inward rather than just assessing your outside world. Other theorists, no different than in the Roman Empire, observed a different pattern of human behavior. And these are theorists in the time, right? So not just, no, I'm not talking about people describing the Chinese and the classical Chinese or the classical Greek. This is Chinese theorists during that period and Greek philosophers, etc. They observed a different pattern of human behavior that identified evil or weak tendencies in individuals. Those needed governing and control so they didn't compromise communities. And all of that brings me to the second point. One of the emerging truths about humans that became a highly contested and perpetual, even to this day, argument is based in conceptions about human nature. Are humans good or evil? Naturally? Do we tend toward positive or negative outcomes when left on our own? Do we have the ability to become good if we start evil? And vice versa. Do we have the ability to start evil or become evil if we start out good? In China, it played out between the Confucian schools and the legalistic schools, but they weren't unique in this, just expressed it with their own heritage. Ultimately, though, and we discussed this last time in Rome, contrasting the participative res publica and the virtuous tyrant theory, one that emerged in Confucian philosophy as well. But the question that persists here is, how much do people truly need, governance and authoritative control, and how much do they need freedom? The progress of the Qin dynasty established a very strict rule that was based in fear of losing control. Nevertheless, this established a mechanism for controlling the outcome of a community that the Han dynasty picked up. The Qin dynasty didn't last nearly as long as either the Greek or the Romans, but it just laid the foundation and the groundwork for the Han dynasty, which lasted over 200 years. I'm sorry, no, 400 years. My math was rough. Clearly, this method of control, the balance of governance and freedom that they found was effective. But it was also oppressive. The application of Confucian thought was imperfect, and the powerful classes of the Han dynasty got more powerful, while there was always someone underfoot, and eventually they revolted and the dynasty fell. This is no different from how the Roman Empire fell. And we see it played out over and over again. that there's some balance of power that humans strive to, and when it gets comfortable, it falls apart. And so the question really is it inevitable that there are power structures? Is it woven into the fabric of humanity that there is a class in power and a class that is subjugated? And perhaps it is, and this might be because of the warring states of the human person themselves. Confucius, Aristotle, Plato, Mencius, Marcus Aurelius, all of these wise men identified that there are layers of natures in the human individual. Whether it's appetites or desires, perversions, virtues, vices, wishes, etc., all of these different versions of self have a role in making up one single human and their actions. Each of these wise men also posited that a best self is possible, but it requires subordination. It requires putting a governing rule in place in order to bring out the best. The tense battlefield for the human person is expanded then to the drama of social order, whether it is small in river valley villages or at the scale of the Roman and Han empires. Finally, the last little bit of insight I want to share, which dovetails with the previous tension between governance and individualistic freedom, is the contrast between epic and the personal. Though there were so many similarities between the cultural advancements of the Han Dynasty and the Greek and Romans, one area that did not share between them was in the scope of their literature. While the Greeks identified themselves with the great epics of Homer, and the Romans fabricated their own epic identity as well, the literature of imperial China did not, though they had every reason to. The scale of their armies, think about the emperor's tomb, their defenses, think about the Great Wall, and their battles, all of these would easily warrant or justify great epic tales. And yet, the poetry and literature of the Chinese was personal, practical, based on home life or on specific individual action in domestic circumstances. And as the book, our textbook writes, quote, "It does not so much glorify individual prowess or valorizes achievement as it meditates on human experience," end quote. You can experience this yourself in the excerpts in the book. But it is worth wondering about the cultural state of mind that looks inward to the day-to-day felt and lived experience rather than to the imaginative projection of best self, like the epic tales of the West. And with that, we'll close this chapter and bring to end our first major period from prehistory to classical cultures. Instructions for your midterm are on D2L, and please let me know if you have any questions. You'll see your prompt for the response to this chapter, which will be a short written response as well. Thank you very much.